Good evening on this Friday, September 14th. Welcome to the Woodchuck Report. I'm the host, V. Chase, and we've got some things I got in for you today on this beautiful day. Although if you're down further south on the East Coast, you're not having a beautiful day. In case you haven't been aware, there's Hurricane Florence is on its way. And I saw earlier reports too. I saw satellite imagery. There's 7 more tropical storms following after. I believe they're going out to which is Isaac, which I believe is the 9th one of the season. They go alphabetical order, by the way, in case you're wondering. So, just take care of some local in-house news. I would like to thank fellow libertarians, Archie Flower and Jeff Colfer. They're both running for state senate. Archie's running for Addison seat, and Jeff is running for the Bennington seat. So I'd like to throw applause. Hats off to you, gentlemen. Have a great time. I hope you do well, obviously. I hope you win, both of you. Moving on, this is just something that happened to pique my interest and made me chuckle. On the Republican side, a H broke page, for those of you who went to the primary nominations. If you remember, if you chose the Republican ballot, his name was on there for multiple nominations. Actually, I wrote them down. He earned the Republican nomination for U.S. Senate, U.S. House, State Treasury, Secretary of State, Auditor of Accounts, and Attorney General. So, of course, he had to withdraw from all of those. I believe he's choosing to run for State Treasury, but I currently forget. I didn't indicate it to myself. And the reason why it made me chuckle was because mostly rules. The fact that he won all of them means that there is a Republican on those ballots come November. So the fact that he withdrew all the Republicans now, well, as of when this actually came about, they had 7 days to fill his name in, well, fill someone in for his spot. But they're at least the Republicans on the ballot. So I just chuckled that. Hats off to you guys for playing the rules great, or well, should I say. Continuing on, Christine Halquist, who's the Progressive Democrat nomination, she won her nomination, so she'll be going against Phil Scott, who is currently obviously he's our governor in the Republican nomination. Two things on the Libertarian national side, over across the lake there. Larry Sharpe, who's running for governor of New York, I've been watching some of his little internet podcasts, well, less podcasts, but more videos. And hats off to him. Good luck to him as well. And last I checked, Gary Johnson, who's running for governor of Arizona. The article I was reading about him earlier said that he has a 21-point lead on his opponent. So this could be at least historic for party in itself and for him as well. So that takes care of that. The two major topics that I would like to talk about today on the economics and political side is autarky and tragedy of commons. And one pertains more to current times and the other, well, they both always pertain. But quick thing, I'll talk with the tragedy of commons first. I have a bunch of notes in case you can't see, but I can. So, the tragedy of commons. It is a term which is used in social science, which it describes a situation in which a shared resource system where the individuals which act independently of each other, so they are acting to their own free will, and according to their own self-interest, they behave contrary to the long-term common good of all users. And they do that by depleting or spoiling a resource through their collective action. So, and this is it's a concept and a phrase which originated in 1833, long time ago, by British economist William Forster Lord. God, I love those 3 names. I want a 3 name. But anywho, he was using the hypothetical example of unregulated grazing on common lands in the British Isles. So, the concept became widely known due to an article by American ecologist Garrett Hardin approximately 100-something years, 135 years later, in 1968. And in modern economic context, common means shared and unregulated resources, such as atmosphere, oceans, rivers, and fish stocks, and even the office refrigerator could be considered a common in modern day context. While it is technically a misnomer, it is often cited in connections with sustainable development. It meshes economic growth with environmental protection, as well as in the debate over climate change/global warming, and has been used to analyze behavior in fields of economics, evolutionary psychology, anthropology, game theory, politics, and taxation and sociology. Now, where did I leave that off? I have a huge list of things here. So, some of the things that are used in examples of tragedy of commons is, I read off my list here, planet Earth ecology, uncontrolled human population growth leading to overpopulation, a preference for sons made people aboard fetal girls. This results in an imbalanced gender ratio, China being a huge and extreme example, their one-child policy. Air, whether ambient air polluted by industrial emissions in cars or any form of internal combustion engines, among other sources of air pollution or indoor air. Water pollution, water crisis over extraction of groundwater and wasting water due to over irrigation. California, looking at you. Human and wildlife conflict, energy resources and climate, environmental residue of mining, drilling, burning of fossil fuels, and consequential global warming. The oceans, overfishing. Antibiotics, antibiotic-resistant misuse of antibiotics anywhere in the world will eventually result in antibiotic resistance developing at an accelerated rate. The resulting antibiotic resistance has spread and will likely continue to do so in the future to other bacteria and other regions, hurting or destroy the antibiotic commons that are shared on a worldwide basis. For those of you who may not know, there are currently antibiotic-resistant diseases. I believe there's actually an STD, I want to say a variant of gonorrhea. I only vaguely heard about this, that's why it's not fresh in my head. But that is currently immune to all known antibiotic drugs. So there's one. And then moving on to publicly shared resources, spam email, everyone knows about that. Well, it degrades the usefulness of the email system and it increases the cost of all users of the internet while providing a benefit to only a tiny number of individuals. Vandalism and littering in public spaces such as parks, recreation areas, and public restrooms. We have knowledge of commons, which encompass immaterial and collectively owned goods in the information age currently. Examples being source code and software documentation in software projects that can get polluted with messy code or inaccurate information. And skills acquisition and training when all parties evolve past the buck on implementing it. So, tragedy of commons, just a long list of examples. I'm sure many of you, much smarter than myself, can come up with more, and some have. But some of the things that does deal with in regards is, although the common resources have been known to collapse due to overuse, there are many examples and current existing examples in which members of a community with access to a common resource are able to cooperate or regulate to exploit these resources prudently without collapse. Now, there's a common dilemma with this, common dilemma in of itself, which is a specific class of social dilemma in which people's short-term self-interests are at odds with long-term group interests and the common good. Anyone who's ever taken game theory would know very well firsthand how that is. I do remember game theory class. It's a very upsetting class. Now, what are some of the solutions to this tragedy of commons? There are multiple solutions to tragedy of commons. Many of them being, for example, non-governmental solutions, governmental solutions, privatization, and regulation. The biggest and most commonly used generally are government solutions. In certain cases, government will privatize common resources, but generally speaking, everyone here knows this very well, they resort to regulation. So reading out some of the solutions, for the non-governmental solution, some of the things here is sometimes the best governmental solution may be to do nothing. Robert Axelrod contends that even self-interested individuals will often find ways to cooperate because collective restraints serve both the collective and individual interests. Now, anthropologist G.N. Apple, he criticized those who cited Hardin, who was the one who came up with this, as I said earlier, to impose their own economic and environmental rationality on other social systems of which they have incomplete understanding and knowledge of. Now, there's a whole bunch of people who went through non-governmental solutions criticizing the idea of tragedy of commons. Political scientist Elinor Ostrom, who was awarded the 2009 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science for her work on the issue. She also revisited Hardin's work back in 1999. Feels so long ago. And similarly, geographer Douglas L. Johnson, who also remarks that nomadic tribes, nomadic pastoralist societies of Africa and the Middle East, in fact, have been able to balance local stocking ratios against seasonal rangeland conditions in ways that were ecologically sound. And then Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues, they looked at how real-world communities are able to manage communal resources such as fisheries, land irrigation systems, and farmlands. And they identified a number of factors conducive to successful resource management. Now, on government solutions, we have things such as privatization, which kick it over to the private organization. And we also have things of regulation. Typical example is to limit the amount of a common good that is available for use by an individual. Primary example would be California during the drought. The governor instituted water rations. Of course, back to the tragedy of commons idea, is people used it anyways as much as they could use, and it helped make the situation worse. So some of the criticism of the whole tragedy of commons ideology and concept is that the claims that the tragedy of commons is mostly used as a propaganda for private ownership. Environmentalist Derek Johnson says it's been used by the political right wing to hasten the final enclosure of the common resource of third world and indigenous people worldwide as part of the Washington Consensus. He goes on to argue that in true situations, those who abuse the commons would have been warned to desist, and if they failed, would have punitive sanctions against them. He says that rather than being called the tragedy of commons, it should be called the tragedy of the failure of the commons. So that is that concept that I would talk to you about. The next one, the big one that I wish to talk about is autarky, and you'll see as I explain and talk about it how it relates to our modern day economic situation, especially here in the US, and especially with our current President Trump and his philosophy and ideology. So, autarky is the quality of being self-sufficient, which is usually applied to political systems or economic systems. So it exists whenever an entity, such as the US, can survive or continue without outside assistance or international trade. Now, autarky is not necessarily political, but it also may be military, in which a country is able to protect itself from another country or could manufacture all of its weapons without outside assistance. Now, various societies have utilized different levels of autarky. Back in the 18th century, 16th to 18th century, European mercantilists, they attempted to augment the state power by limiting international trade. Nazi Germany also used more extensive forms of autarky to try to maximize trade within its own economic bloc. And now, autarkic systems are really opposites of liberal economic systems, in which they encourage the free trade of capital, goods, services, and labor. Now, Adam Smith, who is considered the father of modern economics, he argued along the mercantilist policies was followed by the British Empire, was detrimental to the economic growth of the British Empire and helped more or less its soft collapse. Although you can argue that the British Empire never really collapsed. Now, President Trump is very deeply influenced by this because you can tell by many of his policies that he's been attempting and enacting. And so some of the ideas of autarky, they come from German economist Friedrich List. I'm probably pronouncing that name wrong. It probably is Friedrich List. In his 1841 book, The National System of Political Economy. Now, he in turn was influenced by Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling. There's another, I really do want a long name, who was George Friedrich Hegel's roommate in college. So, full circle right there. Now, at the roots of Hegelian philosophy is a longing for a strong state to swamp individuals' decision-making. This is not so much more of an economic but philosophical and political history. Political history which must drive towards centralized power under great men and their intellectual advisors. So, economic forces must be restricted to the bounds of the nation state because these bounds are the limits of the jurisdiction of the powers that be. Trade outside the borders represents a kind of treason against the state power. More of layman's terms, to keep all production within the state because the state can control all production. So anything outside of that is treason amongst the state. Stop me if you've seen versions of this in, say, Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, as I use examples, and generally most straight communist and totalitarian and authoritarian governments. Now, the idea of autarky, which stands in complete opposition to free trade and its theories. So Adam Smith's renderings, the fundamental basis of wealth creation is the expansion of the division of labor. This broadens the expansion, whether it's outside of the family, the city walls, or beyond nation's border. The great opportunity exists to build a prosperous city. So, some of the problems for us free traders is that autarkic thoughts are always lurking. No matter how much free trade gets, the benefits of free trade get thrown out or shown by numerous stats, data, examples. There's always what is generally considered nationalist tendencies to look inward. So, and many of these nationalist tendencies tend to begin as simple ideas to, for example, to protect domestic producers from a cheaper foreign product. And then this slowly mutates to gradually be based on simple economic errors. You have situations questions that get asked, what sense is ever a benefit for a nation, for any producer to make things abroad and bring them back in? Very big example is Apple. Apple manufactures the majority of their iPhones over in China, sells it back to us. That's one of the questions that a autarkic ideology starts asking. What benefit is the country? Economic benefit is immensely. More questions are, doesn't that just cast jobs away, which is what's always asked, and doesn't that drain the national wealth, which is generally what the certain members of the conservative Republican Party have asked. Excuse me, I think I might have a question that someone's just sent me. Nope, not a question. False alarm. So that is autarky. There's one more thing that I wanted to talk about, since I got that through a little quicker than I was expecting, and I got told by my guy over here, got 10 minutes left, is the article that caught my attention is, for most U.S. workers, real wages have barely budged in decades. Now, this is by Drew Da Silva of Pew Research org. So if you don't trust Pew Research, then essentially ignore everything I'm about to tell you. And so I'm going to read bits and pieces of his paper here. And the very first paragraph, which is really what caught my eye. So, reading off verbatim, on the face of it, these should be heady times for American workers. U.S. unemployment is as low as it's been in nearly 2 decades, 3.9% as of July, and the nation's private sector employers have been adding jobs for 101 straight months, 19.5 million since the Great Recession. Related cuts finally abated in early 2010, and 1.5 million just since the beginning of the year. Second paragraph, but despite the strong labor market, wage growth has lagged economists' expectations. In fact, despite some ups and downs over the past several decades, today's real average wage, that is the wage after accounting for inflation, has about the same purchasing power it did 40 years ago. And what wage gains there have been have mostly flowed to the highest paid tier of workers. So that was the 2 lines two paragraphs that really caught my attention, and I will put up the articles because it has a lot of interesting graphs and data. Huge fan of graphs and data that will show that both the real wage and the current nominal wage and how it's adjusted for inflation. So he goes on to write that there's a disconnect between the job market and workers' paycheck, which has fueled much of the recent activism in states and cities around which has been raising minimum wages, and it's also become a factor in at least some of this year's congressional campaigns. President Trump has been proudly proclaiming that, which rightfully he can. And so, going on some more since I still got time. Average hourly earnings for non-management private sector workers in July were $20.65, up 3 cents from June and 2.7% above the average wage from a year earlier, according to the data from the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's in line with average wage growth over the past 5 years. Year-over-year growth has mostly ranged between 2% and 3% since the beginning of 2013. But in the years just before the 2007-8 financial collapse, average hourly earnings often increased by around 4% year over year. And during the high inflation years of the 1970s and early 1980s, average wages commonly jumped 7%, 8%, or even 9% year over year. And I believe that's my 5 minutes. And I'm going to let him know we are good. So that's just an excerpt from this. Next, actually, there will not be one next month. There will not be a Woodchuck Report next month. They are doing the nominations and interviews for November election. So the next time I will be up will probably be November's. So if you're expecting or waiting for an October Woodchuck Report, there will not be. It will be next November. And with that, I say thank you for joining in, and you have a great day. Stay away from the weather.